Kia ora, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Citizen A, where we wrap the week's current affairs with the best political team on television from a very, very, very Auckland perspective. Warning, we're as fair and balanced as Fox News. Joining me tonight are my revolving panel of bloggers and Auckland opinion shapers. Here's a multimedia Shakespearean jester speaking truth to power. He is editor of independent news site scoop.co.nz, the ever-brilliant Selwyn Manning. And he is one of New Zealand's best-known economic commentators who shocked the market last year when he questioned the tenets of free market faith. For him, the Bears are definitely feasting on the bull. Editor of interest.co.nz, Bernard Hickey, welcome to you both. Coming up tonight, Issue 1, the Rena fiasco. Can impotence cripple a government? And what does this disaster say for deep sea drilling? Issue 2, has John Key suffered a credibility downgrade over his credit downgrade comments? And how optimistic do you need to be to believe after the $18 billion deficit announced this week that the government can return to surplus by 2014? Issue 3 tonight, Occupy Queen Street is happening this Saturday in solidarity with the Wall Street occupation. Post-1929 stock market collapse, communism and fascism competed with democracy for hegemonic political dominance. Post-2008 stock market collapse, how do a disparate collection of angry, poverty-stricken occupiers challenge capitalism's excesses? And we'll end the show on a final word, but let's kick things off with Issue 1. The jaw-dropping lack of anything that even resembled a concerted response to the Rena disaster has angered the country. As tons of filth wash ashore, John Key's government looks impotent. Selwyn, if you look at the formal review of New Zealand's Oil Pollution Preparedness and Response Capability Report that was released in June this year, it noted the utter lack of preparedness the corporatised model provided. Can the free market clean up Rena oil spill?
No, I mean, this whole thing does expose a lot of problems that are underlying the government's push to actually open up deep sea drilling. Now, clearly this ship was not related to deep sea drilling, but what it does expose is New Zealand's lack of preparedness for when things go wrong. You know, we are isolated. You can see that from what we're seeing playing out on our television screens by the day at the moment. You know, there is not a big body of international assistance coming in here with all of the hardware to address these problems. We're here pretty much on our own. Yes, there's some thinking coming across from offshore, but it does expose the vulnerabilities of the government's tactics trying to actually balance wherever it's going strategically. This is a real problem.
Do you think John Key's response today, which was, well, what would you have done better? Think that's the kind of leadership the country's looking for?
No, it's not. I think this comes on the tails of a 3-week period where John Key has seen that the gloss and the positive spin doesn't always work. What we're starting to see here is a man, as opposed to a leader, that is starting to think, do I really want this job? And I think that's what we're seeing in these responses. The country actually needs leadership on this. If he can't do it, it needs one of his cabinet who has the skills to actually get out there and provide that.
Bernard, with fines of only $600,000 available to individuals and liability capped at $14 million, the public are going to have to pick up the financial cost as well as the environmental cost. What political cost do you think that brings?
I'm less pessimistic from the government's point of view about how this will affect their popularity. I think most people will blame the shipping captains and maybe the lack of preparedness of the system. But will they blame John Key for that? He seems to have an extraordinarily Teflon-like ability to shrug these things off. He's still at record popularity after Pike River, after the Christchurch earthquake, after the downgrades. So the suggestion that this might derail Key's leadership or the government, I think, is a bit far-fetched. But it does raise legitimate questions about how we have created our public institutions that provide public services. They've been corporatised. The Act that was brought in for maritime affairs essentially gives a free pass to the shippers and to the ports on the issue of cleaning up environmental messes. And it does raise this issue of what I call externalities. This is where a company does something that causes a costs for everyone over a long period of time but doesn't pay for it. Eventually those costs are socialised. How do we make sure that those costs are privatised when they're caused by privatised problems? And it raises questions about these these sort of public infrastructure assets like ports, like airports, like railways, like buses, the sorts of things that we all rely on, and where the costs eventually are borne by everyone. Surely the costs should be put onto the private company.
How do you think that we should go about making sure that cost does actually end up with the private company?
Well, for a start, you lift the thresholds on
Right.
the payments for environmental
And can we do
damage.
that retrospectively?
Yeah, well, that's the thing, because a lot of these costs are incurred at one time but borne at another time by a much larger group of people. And you only have to look at the sort of environmental costs that we're getting from dairying, for example, where things are being done now, things are leaching through the soil, and eventually the cost is borne by a large number of people in the future. This is where you're essentially consuming your future. And those consumption costs should be borne at the time in which they're incurred by the people who incur them, not by the public.
I'll just pick up on this issue about credibility of John Key. It has been dented. I'm not suggesting, and I don't think many people are suggesting, that there are issues out there at the moment that are going to derail the national government's campaign to regain the Treasury benches. But what has happened in the last 3 weeks is we've had some members of the press gallery waking up to the failures and frailties of John Key's argument and testing him. All of those people out there that have watched, for example, opposition television program 3 News, would have been able to see in the last 3 weeks a slow unpicking of his credibility, to the point where he is standing there pretty much a leader naked in front of the public and saying, this is what's left here. His answers to misleading the House, for example, was no, 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 and I had a third party person who I'm not going to name, who is confidential, providing me with that information.
Well, we'll get into that
well,
in a second.
I'm sorry, it's not good enough.
The government spin doctors, Selwyn, have done everything to claim this disaster is from Mars and any possible deep sea drilling disaster is from Venus, and that any comparison is stupid. But if we can't handle a disaster outside a port, how will we handle a deep sea drilling disaster at a depth 4 times deeper than the Gulf of Mexico event?
Well, certainly no better than what the United States did with the Gulf of Mexico issue.
And they were much larger government, right?
And also see how difficult it was for the Obama administration as it was embedding in to basically being an effective federal government there to deal with a multinational like BP over this issue is extremely difficult. Imagine how New Zealand is. Now, putting that in there, New Zealand does have to obviously look at ways of developing resource and turning that into a benefit for the economy in this country. But at what expense? And we've got to go through this obviously very carefully.
It was really interesting reading the report into our ability to handle these disasters and how little equipment we had,
the hardware,
and where it was in the wrong place and how long it took to get there. If we're going to have deep sea drilling, the costs of building that equipment, making sure you can get onto the scene quickly and deal with it, should be borne by the drillers themselves. And we're not talking small costs here, we're talking about large costs that can be clawed back through license fees or through royalty revenues over time, so that if the worst comes to the worst, the machinery and the equipment and the plans are in place and they're paid for by the drillers.
To protect our own interests in this way. I mean, for example, look at the Pike River disaster. Terrible situation.
Lax regulation. Lax regulation.
Yeah, but also the hardware. We were reliant on Australia to provide us with robots to get inside in that initial kind of window period right at the beginning of that. That showed a vulnerability even in mining areas on terra firma. Imagine what it would be like when, worst case scenario occurs out in the deep sea. We're not new to deep sea drilling in this country, but in a way we have an opportunity to politicise this, to develop some sort of regulations. That pragmatic common sense approach that Bernard is addressing there, hopefully in the political chambers, that would actually gain some momentum.
Question to both of you, how would you rate out of 10 the government's response to date?
It seems slow. I'm less willing to put the boot in. I'd give it a 6 or a 7.
6 or a 7?
I would say a 4 because it's almost non-existent apart from a helicopter ride by the Prime Minister yesterday.
Question to both of you. Our conventional wisdom was that the Rugby World Cup would eliminate politics from the public radar. With this event, is that conventional wisdom dented regardless of who wins the final?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, it's obviously something that every New Zealander is hoping will happen. If they're loyal to the country, they like their sport, the All Blacks winning or getting through the semi-final would be a great thing. The government's going to capitalise on it, it has all the way through, but these issues, thankfully, have got through that gloss and that positive filter. You know, these issues, like for example, the government's handling handling of the SAS issue over in Afghanistan, the mishandling of that from a spin point of view, misleading the House, the economic kind of malaise that is there despite the Prime Minister's positive kind of angles on everything. All of that, I think, is getting through to the public. What we do need to see now is basically some real strong political analysis on what that means as far as transferring a positivity or a negativity that we identify into policy outcomes in the next term.
Rugby World Cup doesn't look nearly so important now, does it?
Well, the reason this has grabbed the attention is that there's shocking images. I mean, the ship breaking up, the oiled birds that look like blobs of oil. This is it's a shocking thing for New Zealanders who love their beaches, and this is a beach that many people have been to.
Yeah.
It's very close to a built-up area. There's billions of dollars worth of property values.
That's right. I
remember as a little kid, you know, we were preparing to go on what was my first holiday up to Whangarei Heads, to a place called Riatahi Bay. And about 2 days before we were heading up there, just before Christmas, one of Onasis's oil tankers burst at Marsden Point, and there was a spill of crude oil, and it went in with the tide and it went out with the tide, and it was all over those beaches. It was thick and it stunk. Now that was small in comparison to this, and it took years for it to get off the rocks. The ecology was damaged for years and years and years. This is momentous.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 2. Turns out that John Key's source for his claim that Standard & Poor's would downgrade our credit under a change of government was nothing more than bloke down pub gossip. Selwyn, has the Prime Minister suffered a credibility downgrade here? Did he mislead Parliament?
Well, you know, credibility downgrade, yes. In my view, absolutely. Anyone who wants to hear and listen would have, you know, come to that conclusion. For those who choose not to, maybe not. Did he mislead Parliament? I take a view where Parliament, particularly during question time and the general debate, is the highest court in the New Zealand land. So therefore, everybody who is engaging on the debate should be balancing their opinions on a foundation of fact. For the Prime Minister to insert into the debate stuff that he wasn't sure perhaps was actually accurate or not, that his source of that information was certainly not official, but we don't know the source of it because he refuses to identify, well then it's undermining the credibility of the House, it's undermining the strength of the debate, and it's undermining in some ways the actual function of our parliamentary aspect of our democracy. It's an appalling state of affairs.
Bernard, Standard & Poor's neutrality suggests that they'd never make a claim like that, even if it were true. Key must have known this and known that they would have contradicted his claim. Was this a misstep by him?
It was opportunism gone wrong.
Really?
He saw an opportunity with an email that he remembered. He's very light on his feet in terms of plucking these details and putting them into the debate. He's very confident of his ability to just throw stuff in there. And for the last 3 years, he hasn't been challenged that aggressively on these things. And to be caught out in Parliament, relying on second-hand information from a ratings agency that he needs to keep happy.
Right.
He's essentially put them in the shtuck by saying you were partisan in your views. So this isn't a good look for John Key, but I think at the core of it, what's more worrying for New Zealand and in the long term is the downgrade itself, and what it says about the government's performance. Remember, we've had a government for the last 3 years that has campaigned through the budgets on the view we have to do this to avoid that. Well, that happened, and the questioning, I was surprised at the lack of tough questioning of the government's performance in improving, for example, our current account deficit and dealing with the debt issues that we have, in identifying the differences between private and public debt, in assuming that the ratings agencies would let us off lightly because our public debt isn't that high relative to others. These are the real questions that I think are more important in terms of New Zealand's long-term future and our ability to service those debts and grow the economy, because this is a damaging thing for that economic growth in the long term. It will increase borrowing costs, upwards of 1% to maybe 1.5%, most people agree. And that's a cost for everyone, households, businesses. It will slow growth and mean that long-term more people are unemployed.
So, in half of the $18 billion deficit is the Christchurch earthquake, but borrowing for tax cuts and subsidising those tax cuts with the raise in GST is the government's responsibility, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
So shouldn't they be a little bit more upfront about their responsibility in this deficit?
Yeah, I do. I think there's been a mixed message that we identified 2 weeks ago, where Bill English returned back to New Zealand, Finance Minister returns, and he has a different song sheet to the Prime Minister on this. In some ways, I felt that Bill English was actually addressing a mood that he had identified for some time, and took his opportunity through an interview with Duncan Garner, extended one on the internet via 3 News. To me, it spoke volumes, and we've got the guru, as far as I'm concerned, relating to analysing such things here sitting on the panel today. But from a strategic point of view, as opposed to the detail of the economic kind of evaluations of it, I do think that the government needs to actually stay on message. And I think that message is coming, the sound one, the rational one, is coming from the Finance Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister here. I do think that it is indicative, perhaps, that the National Party has internal problems, particularly within its cabinet, of where the ideology has moved off the centre ground. And I think what we're doing is, what we're seeing here is members that have traditionally perhaps gravitated around the centre, like Bill English, certainly Simon Power, and certainly Dr. Wayne Mapp, are starting to actually look like they're singing in more independent song sheet than what the Prime Minister is trying to lead off on. If you look at those in the more right-wing side of the National Cabinet, we're not seeing that. That they're keeping they're keeping tight to John Key's message.
Bernard, with the $18 billion deficit announced this week, how optimistic does one need to be to accept that the current policy will lead to surplus by 2014?
Very optimistic now, particularly this week with the profit warning from Fletcher Building. A drop in profit of 10 to 20% because of a slow house building sector and a slow rebuild in Christchurch. The government was relying on the rebuild starting in Christchurch to help power the economy along, and also relying on high commodity prices to keep powering the economy. But what we're seeing overseas, the problems in the slowing growth in Europe and the United States, and the risk of a hard landing in China, is that commodity prices have come off quite substantially, even in dairy, for example. And that is going to drag down on growth, although luckily we have the exchange rate dropping off its highs a bit to help out. But this means that it's going to be harder for the government to get the revenue growth going to achieve the surplus within a couple of years. And most economists say that some extra action will have to be taken in the next year or so if they're going to get anywhere near that. You've got to step back a bit and look at what's happened over the last 3 to 4 years. The economy that's not involving the government, so the private sector, has contracted sharply. So last year it contracted 7%. And the reason our economy hasn't contracted that much is because the government has stepped into the breach. Remember, the government's spending in the last year was $100 billion. That is 50% of GDP. Now, we're going to see the government over the next couple of years withdraw some of that stimulus as it reduces its spending growth. And we have to have the rest of the economy pick up the slack. It's a bit like pushing a car that's got a flat battery. The government pushes for a while, but then eventually the car has to start itself.
You know, Bernard, I always wondered the sanity, really, of the national-led government going into a new term at a time where the global economy was fragile, where it started to tamper with things that potentially worked well. For example, in the export, if you were moving back to an export-led economy that New Zealand always needs to do, cutting R&D to those companies that are burgeoning exporters, issues like that, undermining perhaps the abilities of our trade missions overseas to actually map out where good markets are for particular commodities or product or service. All of those types of things have been stripped away, and it seemed like, business people that traditionally put a national government in and yet we saw a government retrenching from some of those things, that when things are very, very uncertain, they're taking certainty out of the actual framework.
And I think it's time to now say that the big tax switch looks like it's failed.
Right.
When you look at the government's figures for the last year, the tax cuts for those on higher incomes actually reduced government revenues by 2.8 billion. We are borrowing money from offshore to give tax cuts to those on higher incomes.
Unbelievable.
And that money is not being saved as the government expected in productive sectors. The idea was we'd give the tax cuts to the rich, they would save it, it would be invested in export industries. But what we're seeing instead, and we've seen the numbers in the last couple of months, is another surge in the housing market, particularly in Auckland. So some of those tax cuts are being used with foreign debt added on top to buy more expensive houses. House prices in central Auckland are up 6% from January alone. So the big tax switch hasn't worked to fix the government books. It also hasn't worked to turn us into a more export-focused
And the irony being that the housing stock in Auckland is too low for the population, and those in the low and medium income earning brackets are actually suffering for it.
Question to you both. How well is the Minister of Finance, Bill English, sleeping at the moment?
I think for the last 3 to 4 years he's had broken sleep, and the last 3 to 4 months again has been very broken, because I don't think a lot of people in New Zealand are aware at how close to the brink the European financial system is. We've had over the last 3 to 4 weeks the likes of the US Treasury Secretary say there is a risk of catastrophic bank runs across Europe. We've had an advisor to the IMF say that the global financial system is within 2 to 3 weeks of a complete meltdown. We've seen all sorts of signs of banking stress across Europe, including the collapse of Dexia Bank, and there are fresh signs that the next 2 to 3 weeks are shaping up as crucial. We've got a big summit on October the 23rd in Europe, ahead of a G20 summit. If the Europeans can't fix their problems before then, we're looking at real trouble, and then Bill English will struggle to sleep.
How's the sleep?
Well, I thought he was in a deep sleep, almost a coma, back in February after the earthquake, and he said he didn't have an economic answer to New Zealand's problems in his back pocket. And I thought, well, that's a bit rich coming from the person that everybody's expecting to actually come through with a plan here. What we're facing here, I think everybody watching the program knows exactly what we're facing in the next 12 months, next 3 years, and that is basically just harder times, harder to keep your jobs at the levels that we are getting now, harder to actually find new progressive kind of opportunities in the New Zealand domestic economy.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 3 tonight. In solidarity with the Wall Street occupation movement sweeping America, Occupy Queen Street is happening this Saturday. Post-1929 stock market collapse, communism and fascism competed with democracy for hegemonic political dominance. Post-2008 stock market collapse, how do a disparate collection of angry, poverty-stricken occupiers challenge capitalism's successes? Selwyn, how do the occupiers change the debate?
Oh, by getting out there and actually expressing what they believe is needing to actually be put out there. I think, you know, if they were looking at some sort of way of denting you know, those who subscribe to a capitalist kind of ideology, well, in my gut, my view is that that's a war that was going on a long time ago. I think at the moment there's an issue of progressive kind of ideas, and if what can come out of the occupations around the world, and out of the one in Queen Street in Auckland on the weekend coming, that there was some sort of ideas of solution-based kind of ideas, ideologies, well then that would be great. I think that's what we're all probably hoping to see come out.
Bernard, can the Washington consensus really be toppled by mass movements?
I think there is a potential here for at least the centre of gravity to shift. Whether it'll be toppled is another thing. We've seen it toppled in the likes of Egypt and other places because a lot of the democratic institutions are not there. The democratic institution in the United States certainly is damaged, some say beyond repair. In Europe it's a bit stronger. I think there's a real chance of governments changing, policies changing because of what's happening. Remember, it's been going for longer there. It was initially called not Occupy Wall Street but Los Indignados in Europe, where a lot of Spanish, French and Greek protesters were doing the business of camping in the squares with their laptops and phones, tweeting and Facebooking the stuff. And in the United States the movement is spreading because frankly, the abuses of the taxpayer. I mean, aside from ideologies, if you're a taxpayer in America, you've watched your money bail out huge banks, make them even riskier, and then allowed them to continue on with huge bonuses. At the same time as over the last 20 years we've seen a massive widening of the gap between the very rich and the very poor. Well, not even that, massive widening of the gap between the very rich and the middle class. And people are now saying enough. Now, I think there's a chance that the centre of gravity will shift in America, but you need something much more aggressive and with more impact to actually make a big change.
I think what we're seeing too is capitalism's based on this idea of positivity, of confidence. And when you've got substantial movements that are actually peeling away those aspects of it, well then there's an environment for change. Here in New Zealand, I kind of see that yes, it's one in solidarity to what's happening overseas, but it's also an opportunity perhaps to actually get out there and actually stand up and saying, not really that satisfied with the way things are going here, there must be another way.
A big part of the problem in America is the bailouts. We've had bailouts here too.
That's right,
we tend to forget that South Canterbury Finance was actually a bigger bailout for the New Zealand economy than Lehman Brothers was for America in terms of impact.
On a per capita basis.
And it's affecting our budgets as
well. Let's wrap the show with final words. Selwyn, your final word this week is?
Well, I think, this once again, this absolute tragedy unfolding on the Bay of Plenty gives an opportunity perhaps for some sanity and sound debate around where are we going to be going as a country on such things. Now, this is a vessel, obviously. It's not deep sea mining, but I think there are, people can appreciate that the risks out there on our coastal kind of areas, for the foreshore, the seabed, for the whole of New Zealand, for those living on that coast and others. We need to work out really how we're going to address such things. We get back, we mentioned just before about hardware. We do actually need to think through the worst case scenarios, and as a small economy, make sure that we have them there. And I applaud Bernard's idea of ensuring that that is actually provided by those that are going to exploit our coastlines, as opposed to the New Zealand taxpayer doing it through a central government coffers.
Amen. Bernard, your final word this week is?
I always like to provide a link for people to go and explore more. Look out Matt Taibbi, Taibbi, and Vampire Squid. It's a fantastic article.
It is.
From 2009, 2 years ago, explaining what Goldman Sachs has done to the US economy and the US taxpayer. It, in my view, is a seminal article that has now created the environment for the Occupy Wall Street movement.
Awesome. I will check that out. Thank you, Bernard. Thank you, Selwyn. Ladies and gentlemen, to my final word. After admitting that our SAS are not mentoring in Afghanistan, but are in fact in a full combat role, it turns out civilians we handed over to known torture units had their testicles squeezed until they passed out. Releasing this information while the country's attention is on the Rena disaster is as questionable as us being in that war in the first place. How noble. And on a personal note, as some may have heard, I have been banned from Radio New Zealand for criticising the Prime Minister. Could I say how genuinely humbled and surprised I have been by the phenomenal public support from many people I've never met angry at Radio New Zealand's decision. My gratitude to Brian Edwards, Chris Trotter, Russell Brown, Gordon Campbell, and the hundreds of others who have registered their disgust at such a blatant suffocation of debate 6 weeks out from the general election. Thank you. If you like tonight's show, please join our Citizen A Facebook site and connect with other like-minded news citizens, and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter and Facebook page. Thanks for watching, whānau. Good night, Aotearoa.
Supporting local content so you can see more of New Zealand on air.